you know that there are hidden messages all throughout the Bible? When I found this one, my mind was blown.
All right, let's see it.
It's found in Genesis chapter 5. This chapter covers the generations from Adam to Noah.
It would be more accurate to state that this chapter mentions the genealogies from Adam to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah who are mentioned in the very last verse.
Now here's what we need to understand. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, so these names that are listed, these names have Hebrew meanings attached to them. So let's look at what the names mean. First we have Adam, which means man.
Well, it can mean man, human, or humanity.
Then we have Seth, that means appointed.
So this is the King James Version's translation of the folk etymology from the end of Genesis 4. And scholars are not so sure that that folk etymology is where this name actually comes from. But even if it is, appointed here is just one way to translate this word that comes from a verbal root that means to put, to place, or to set. And so it could also be translated to give, to substitute, to replace. There are a bunch of different ways to understand this. Appointed is only one of them that comes from the King James Version and from the descendants of that translation. And additionally, this is an active verb in the King James Version, and that's going to be important when this video tries to put this all together and interpret what it all means.
We have Enosh, which means mortal.
So Enosh just means human being. It's a synonym for Adam. Mortal is one way that you can interpret it, particularly when it's being contrasted with deity, but the name itself doesn't fundamentally refer to mortality.
Canaan, which means sorrow.
So this is drastically oversimplified. Canaan does not mean sorrow. It may derive from a root that means to sing a funeral dirge or to lament, and it probably has a diminutive ending added onto it, but it could also come from the name Cain. It could come from the people, the Kenites, and could have reference to metalworking, smithing, or it could be the name of a deity. We don't really know for sure, but definitely not sorrow.
Mahalel, which means the blessed God.
Also not quite there. This could mean praise of God. It could mean God is shining or something like that. But the blessed God is a little manipulative.
Jared, which means shall come down.
So the name Jared most likely does come from the verbal root yarad, which means to descend. However, shall come down is partially conjugating the verb rather arbitrarily and in an unwarranted way. We would expect for there to be a subject there, usually a divine name, a theophoric element, as part of the name in order to conjugate it this way. We don't have any such theophoric element. It could have originally had one, but it doesn't necessarily have to have had a subject. And so we should probably understand Jared to just refer to the concept of descent or descending without trying to conjugate the verb in a way that is clearly intended to anticipate being incorporated into a larger sentence.
Next is Enoch, which means teaching.
Enoch doesn't mean teaching. It probably comes from a word that means dedicated or follower or something like that.
Then it's Methuselah, which means his death shall bring.
So Methuselah is incorporating two verbal roots, one that means to die and the other that actually means to cast, to throw, or to send. It does not mean to bring. That's the opposite of what this means, and that's a very arbitrary attempt to try to reread this name in order to make it anticipate and fit into this larger semantic whole.
Lamech, which means despairing.
So scholars aren't exactly sure where the name Lamech comes from or what it means, but when scholars rattle off the etymologies that are most commonly proposed, despairing is not on that list.
And finally we have Noah, which means comfort or rest.
It most likely just means rest.
When we take these names and we line them up with their Hebrew meaning, it's going to spell out a special message to us. Here it is. Man appointed mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down teaching. His death shall bring despairing, comfort, and rest. Put it all together. Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching. His death shall bring the despairing, comfort, and rest. Now, does that message sound familiar to you? This is the gospel message.
So I'm going to start here by pointing out that this all comes from Chuck Missler, who was not a biblical scholar and who most of the time didn't have the first clue what he was talking about. But in addition to the fact that many of these names are just wrong, and we don't even know what some of these names mean, the interpretations that are presented here are entirely arbitrary and presuppose this broader semantic framework that Missler wants to arrive at. And so, starting at the beginning, man is appointed. So we're arbitrarily presupposing a null copula here, the to be verb. But we're also taking that name appointed, which, as I pointed out, is an active verb in the folk etymology that is presented in the King James Version of Genesis 4, and flipping it and making it passive. So instead of man appointed, it's man is appointed. We've reversed the way the name is presented in the text itself. Similarly, at the bottom, despairing, which is not an accurate interpretation of that name, is not being interpreted as an abstract noun, as it should be taken in isolation. It's being interpreted as a substantive, and a plural substantive at that. So the despairing ones, which is completely arbitrary. So we are presupposing specific semantic relationships, and we're presupposing specific interpretations precisely so it can fit into that semantic relationship. And this is just a supersessionist, presuppositional, entirely arbitrary, and profoundly uninformed imposition on the biblical text. And this is pure and utter nonsense.